calls us, don't let it fade.
Welcome to Liberty Monday with Monday. Today we continue our study of the Declaration of Independence by examining the 21st and 22nd of the 27 grievances. These grievances focus on the expansion of violence and instability beyond the colonies themselves, particularly along the frontiers. By this stage in the Declaration, the founders are making a broader case that the Crown was no longer simply misgoverning the colonies, but actively contributing to conditions that endangered lives, property, and the stability of society. Grievances 21 and 22 highlight how conflict was no longer limited to political or economic disputes. It had spread into frontier warfare and insecurity. Context: conflict moves to the frontier. Earlier grievances addressed issues like taxation, courts, and representation. But as tensions escalated, violence began to spread geographically. The frontier regions of the colonies were already complex and often dangerous environments, involving settlers moving westward, indigenous nations defending their lands, competing claims over territory, limited governmental presence. Into this already tense situation, the colonists believed the Crown introduced policies that increased instability rather than reducing it. The 21st grievance, inciting frontier conflict. The text of the grievance: he has endeavored to bring on the inhabitants of our frontiers, the merciless Indian savages, whose known rule of warfare is an undistinguished destruction of all ages, sexes and conditions. What this means? This grievance accuses the Crown of encouraging attacks on colonial frontier settlements by Native American groups. The language used in the Declaration reflects the fears and perspectives of the colonists at the time, particularly those living in frontier regions who experienced violent conflict. From their perspective, British policy appeared to encourage alliances between British forces and certain indigenous groups, direct conflict toward colonial settlements, increase danger for civilians living on the frontier. Understanding the historical context. It is important to recognize that frontier conflict was already ongoing before the Revolution. Indigenous nations had their own political interests, territorial concerns, alliances and rivalries. Some chose to align with the British, others with the colonists, and many sought to defend their lands from encroachment. However, the colonists interpreted British alliances with indigenous groups as a deliberate strategy to weaken colonial resistance. Why this alarmed the colonists? Frontier settlements were often vulnerable due to distance from major population centers, limited military protection, difficult terrain and communication. The perception that the Crown was encouraging attacks in these regions heightened fear and insecurity. To the colonists, this grievance represented a failure to protect subjects, a willingness to escalate violence, a shift toward warfare affecting civilians, the principle at stake. At its core, this grievance reflects the belief that government has a duty to protect its people. When the Crown appeared to support actions that increased danger on the frontier, the colonists concluded that their safety was no longer a priority. The government was not acting in their interests. The relationship between ruler and subject had broken down. The 22nd grievance, expanding warfare beyond civil boundaries. The text of the grievance, while often grouped in interpretation, this grievance continues the theme of widespread violence and insecurity tied to British actions affecting colonial safety and stability. What this means? Although the numbering and phrasing can vary in how these later grievances are grouped in discussion, the broader concern continues: the expansion of conflict into civilian spaces and the increasing inability of the Crown to maintain order and protect life. The colonists believed that British actions had created an environment where violence was no longer contained. Civilian populations were exposed to danger. Stability had broken down across multiple regions. The expansion of conflict. By this stage of the conflict, war was no longer limited to organized armies. Frontier regions faced ongoing attacks and instability. Economic disruption and military conflict overlapped. The result was a sense that the colonies were under widespread threat. Why this was significant? The founders included these grievances to show that the consequences of British policy were not theoretical, they were real and immediate. Colonists were experiencing loss of life, destruction of property, constant uncertainty. This was no longer a dispute over governance. It was a question of security and survival. The principle at stake. The central issue here is the responsibility of government to maintain peace and protect its people. When that responsibility is not fulfilled, or is perceived to be violated, the legitimacy of that government is called into question. The colonists argued that government exists to secure safety and order. Policies that increase danger undermine that purpose. A failure to protect citizens justifies seeking new forms of governance. How Grievances 21 and 22 work together. These grievances reinforce a key theme in the Declaration. The conflict had expanded beyond political disagreements into widespread instability and violence. Together, they describe a situation in which frontier regions were increasingly unsafe, civilian populations were exposed to conflict, the Crown appeared unwilling or unable to restore order. From the colonial perspective, this represented a breakdown of the most basic function of government. Why these grievances were included. The Declaration of Independence was intended to justify separation not only to the colonists, but to the world. By including grievances about frontier violence and instability, the founders emphasized that the consequences of British policy were severe. The colonies were no longer secure under British rule. Independence was necessary to restore safety and stability. These grievances helped demonstrate that the issue was not only political, but practical and immediate. Why these grievances still matter. Grievances 21 and 22 highlight enduring ideas about governance. Governments have a duty to protect their people. Stability and security are essential to liberty. Policies that increase conflict weaken trust in authority. The legitimacy of government depends on its ability to maintain order. They also remind us that the Declaration reflects the perspectives and experiences of its authors, shaped by the realities of their time. Conclusion. Grievances 21 and 22 show how the conflict between Britain and the American colonies expanded into widespread instability, particularly along the frontier. The colonists believed that British policies had increased violence and left them vulnerable, undermining the fundamental responsibility of government to protect its people. For the founders, this was further evidence that the relationship with Britain had fundamentally changed. The Declaration of Independence documents these grievances to explain why the colonies believed independence was necessary, not only to secure political rights, but to restore safety, order, and stability. Understanding these grievances helps us see how the founders viewed liberty not only as a matter of rights, but also of security and the protection of everyday life. Thank you for watching. As always, stay informed, stay free.
Liberty calls us, don't let it